Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk. Happy to be with you. We're going to talk about agriculture policy today. My guest is former Congressman Collin Peterson, who, when I sent the calendar invite for this interview, I immediately spelled his name wrong. But I have a defense for that. He uses 2 L's. I have a good friend since childhood who's also named Collin Peterson who uses 1 L. So I apologize. I used the 1 L spelling and not the 2 L spelling. And I think the 1 L spelling is actually probably a little bit less common. Yeah. Anyway, Congressman Peterson, former Congressman Peterson, on with us to talk about ag policy. And I don't think people understand, all the time here in North Dakota, we talk about energy. That's the thing that makes the most headlines. Agriculture is still neck and neck as important as energy in North Dakota. And I don't think people understand how many political trade-offs there are in terms of ag policy. And I'm not just talking about rural versus urban, because a lot of times, if you're a congressperson from New York and you have a district that is encompassed in like 7 or 8 blocks of New York City, how much do you care about soybeans, right? How much do you care about wheat? I mean, you probably care about it in the intellectual sense, but maybe not so much in a practical day-to-day sense. So there's always a need to build bridges between those two types of constituencies. And then even beyond that, even within agriculture, you have very different types of agriculture depending on which part of the country you're talking about. For instance, agriculture here in the upper Midwest is a very different thing than agriculture in the South. To that point, it's a constant battle to help American agriculture function and define new and exciting ways of doing that. Recently, former Congressman Peterson, along with current U.S. Senator John Hoeven, introduced a new agriculture policy center at North Dakota State University. We're here to talk about that today. Congressman Peterson, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, I'm glad to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you.
And tell us about this Ag Policy Center at NDSU. What's the point? What does it do?
Well, this has been a long process here. This comes out of my experience when I was chairman of the committee in the House. I was chairman of the Ag Committee twice and ranking member the rest of the time. And I watched the Southern interests and the influence that they had because these policy centers that they have had for a number of years. So Mississippi's had one since the 50s, and the Southwest out of Lubbock has had one since 2005, and they're tied into Texas A&M down there in the Southwest, and also Texas Tech and Tarleton and so forth. Those universities work together, and there's a line out of the Agriculture Committee authorization that I put in there in 2007 when I was chairman of the committee that funds those centers. They used to be funded with earmarks, and earmarks got to be a bad news, and so we had to authorize them in the committee. And and I watched the effectiveness of that whole process. They have a guy named Joe Outlaw, who you may have heard of. He has been up to North Dakota a number of times. Whenever they're looking for somebody, an economist, an ag economist, to talk about ag policy, it always ends up being Joe Outlaw from Texas A&M. And he's a great guy, and he's a good friend of mine, and he's been actually helping us set this thing up because he sees the value of if the Midwest can do something similar in terms of ag economic policy, it would be helpful to what he's doing. So anyway, one of the frustrations I had as committee chairman was getting information about changes that I wanted to make. So I could not get accurate information out of the administration, out of USDA, out of their economists, because they didn't have enough people. And that's the value of what Joe does. He is able to tell the people down there in the Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas and so forth, if they want to change something in the cotton program, the peanut program, whatever, he's able to tell them how much it's going to cost, how it impacts other things and so forth. So that's what we're trying to do up here. We're trying to establish the same kind of expertise, if you will, in the Midwest that they have down there. And what I tell people, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create our own Joe Outlaw in the Midwest. So we're gonna house this initially at NDSU to run the money through. But that doesn't mean that everything is going to go to NDSU. So we're working in 12 states, all the way down to Missouri and Kansas, over to Michigan, Ohio, and everything in between. And we're going to work with all those universities to have them make applications to us in terms of what kind of policy stuff they think they can do to help us with, or what we're looking for. And we're just in the process to started this whole process. So it's kind of a long story, but anyway, when I authorized this thing, I authorized $10 million a year out of the Office of the Chief Economist. $8 million of it is being spent at A&M, at FAPRI, at Missouri, and at the University of Nebraska. So there's $2 million left over. So we're going to allocate that $2 million to NDSU to start the policy center. Now, eventually, we're going to hope to be able to raise that amount, and in the future. But this is a place to get started. So Senator Hoeven understood this idea. His staff did, and they've been working with us to make this happen. He's in the right place because he's on the Appropriations Committee, Ag Appropes, and he's also on the Ag Authorizing Committee, which is both of those need to be in play in order to make this work. So that's what we're up to. Greg Lardy at NDSU has been working with us on this. He's well thought of around the Midwest. And the other universities are playing nice at this point. One of the problems you have with universities is they kind of fight with each other, and they all try to get the money for themselves. And that's part of the reason we're not as strong as we should be, because we should not be fighting with each other. We should be working together. And go ahead.
Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, Collin, but do you think folks understand, you spent years on the Ag Committee there, both as chairman and ranking member. And very frankly, you still had a lot of sway there, even when Republicans controlled the House. And I'm a little biased because I'm from Eastern North Dakota, and Collin was kind of North Dakota's second congressman for a long time when I was growing up. But do you think folks understand the population and the makeup that you experienced in the House, with how many more members of Congress represent Southern agriculture versus the upper Midwest here?
No, they probably don't. And that has diminished even more since I left. I mean, I took care of things when I was there. But now, we don't have, especially in the House, we got Dusty Johnson in South Dakota. We have Angie Craig in Minnesota. We have Feenstra. Well, no, he got off the committee. So we have Zach Nunn in Iowa. And
is Ron Kine still there? Was he ever on Ag?
No, he left.
Okay.
He was never on Ag. He was actually a thorn in our side.
Okay.
So there's two new members in Illinois. One of them, Basinski, is on the committee. So it's the Midwest has gone down in terms of people that are there representing our interests, and that's why it makes it all the more important that we have this coalition to be able to bring not just one state and not just maybe North Dakota and Minnesota. That's not enough to sway things. You need the power of these 12 states. And so I recently just added Michigan to this because that's so USDA has a Midwest carve out within their structure, and it includes those 12 states. And so we just kind of copied that. So I went to Michigan and signed up some members for our coalition in Michigan because the chair is from Michigan, Stabenow. She likes what we're doing, and she asked me to go over there and do that. So So I'm just working on this. It's a lot of work. It's a huge area to cover. It's hard to just get around, and to get people to understand what you're doing. But I saw firsthand the effectiveness of the Southerners, and but more than that, you've got to have the information to these policymakers so that they can make the right decisions. And we just don't have the information that we need, and that's what we're trying to do with this new policy center.
Is it hard to keep people focused on this sort of policy area? Because I think a lot of people who are in a political audience are used, especially now, are used to everything being tabloid stories. It's sensational. It's over the top. There's the indictments of President Trump. Everything. It's like we're through the looking glass on so many things. And I think people don't understand that this is what it's supposed to be all about. Like the things that you're talking about are why we elect people to do jobs, to develop good information that policymakers can take action on. And I think that almost, I don't want to use the word boring because it's so central to what we're supposed to be doing, but I think people perceive it that way. So, is it hard to sort of break through to people right now and get them to pay attention to this sort of thing and say, listen, this is really important that we develop this place that can in turn develop real good information and good policy, good data that can then guide us to good policy. Is it hard to break through to people right now?
Well, that's a two-edged sword, because one of the things that I brought to the table in my time out there was to keep the Ag Committee low key, to keep it out of the headlines, to keep it out of all of this nonsense that's going on. And that's how we were able to be a nonpartisan committee, and how we were able to work together, because we just stayed out of all of that stuff. So it is boring, and it is something that most people don't pay that much attention to, and you got to be kind of a nerd.
And by the way, I was not advocating to make it not boring.
No. But I'm just saying, you got to be a nerd kind of to dive into this and to become an expert on like dairy policy and crop insurance. And this is stuff that's very complicated. My background as a CPA has really helped me in understanding this stuff. But now I'm not there. And not only that, most of the members of the Ag Committee in the House are no longer tied to agriculture. And on the Democratic side, they care about food stamps primarily. On the Republican side, they still come from farm districts, but none of them have a farm background. And so they need guidance, they need information so they can hopefully make the right decisions.
Collin, there's a movement now with a little bit more of a focus on trade schools. The state of Minnesota just passed a tuition forgiveness or coverage for families under a certain income threshold I'm sure you're familiar with. And part of the encouragement is to get young students into the trades due to job shortages there. We're seeing, you've seen in over the course of your time in Congress and now, less and less and less people are working and living in areas that are on active farms or working on farms. With the Ag Policy Center and the funding for it at a place like NDSU and the partners here in the Upper Midwest, is there going to be an outreach to what you'd call, quote unquote, city kids to try and talk to them about this and educate them on how much, I live in Fargo, and I am guessing a lot of people my age who are very intelligent that work white collar jobs in offices right now in their 30s, probably, they know that it's a farm state, but they couldn't probably tell you much beyond that, how it impacts a state like North Dakota's economy. Is there some piece of this funding that's going to be part of education outreach?
Well, so one of the strengths of Texas A&M's program is that they have an internship program that is second to none. And when I got to be chairman, I asked my staff to find me some interns from Minnesota or North Dakota, and they couldn't find anybody. And I had 50 interns from Texas A&M trying to get into my office. So if you look at the kids that are working in policy out in Washington, they're mostly coming out of that area because of the advocacy from Texas A&M. So that's part of what we're going to do here. We're going to try to develop an internship program and try to get people to understand that I think the number one high-tech jobs of the future are going to be in agriculture. and people don't get this. These kids don't realize that agriculture is now going to be more high tech than Microsoft, because that's where we're heading, and that's what we have to do in agriculture to be able to feed the world. So we're also going to work to try to educate kids, try to attract the best and brightest to agriculture. It is not farming in agriculture is not riding around on a tractor anymore or baling hay or whatever. It's very high tech, and that's part of what we're going to try to do with this center.
I always try to explain to people, like, something like self-driving cars come out, and we immediately think of like Uber in San Francisco or something, not realizing that some of the first developments in autonomous vehicles was farm machinery.
Yep.
GPS, some of the early uses were in agriculture. Drones, some of the early uses were in agriculture. So when you're talking about being at the bleeding, I think it's already been at the bleeding cutting edge of technology, and I agree with you. I think it's only going to become more so. You were telling us before we started recording, you were just recently down in Iowa, and you're talking with some of the Republicans. You were making a joke. You're the only Democrat with a bunch of Republican candidates in Iowa. And some of the people were coming up. You saw our governor, North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum there. You also saw one of the other candidates, Vivek Ramaswamy. And when you talk to these people, and I guess this is kind of similar to my last question, somebody like Doug Burgum, I think, understands. He's got he's from a farm family. He's governed a farm state. I think he's probably knows more about it than maybe a lot of the other candidates. But when you look at some of these presidential candidates and how key agriculture policy is to this, how do you break through to someone like a Vivek Ramaswamy and say, this is important? And it's always ironic because you see people like that going to Iowa, right? The presidential races traditionally always start in Iowa. It's one of the early vote states, which in farm policy is so important to Iowa. So it's always kind of funny to watch these folks who you don't normally identify with ag policy suddenly showing up in plaid shirts on farms, shaking hands, with somebody on a tractor. A lot of that's performative. How do you get them past the performative part and into real world? This is why this matters, not just for these states, but for our country.
Well, that's part of the process. And this Vivek guy, I didn't have any idea who he was. They brought him up to me, and he looks really young, and they said he's a candidate. I thought he was running for Congress. I had no idea who the hell he was. So I think I kind of offended him. But anyway, he made some comments last spring about ethanol that are now coming home to haunt him because he did not know what he was talking about. Now, Burgum, because he understands this whole issue, he was the big hit down there because he was the only one that actually knew what he was talking about. Now, ethanol, has been a big success story. And it's one of the reasons that farm prices have stayed up where they're profitable because of ethanol. We created that whole new market, But and I don't hope this happens, but if they are successful in getting rid of internal combustion engines, the need for ethanol and oil is going to go away, and so what are we going to do at that point? Well, they aren't going to have electric engines in airplanes. So the sustainable aviation fuel is probably the number one market for ethanol going forward because you can make sustainable aviation fuel out of ethanol. In fact, it's the best feedstock that there is. Now, the environmentalists don't like it because it perpetuates oil, and they're off on a tangent that if they had their way, they'd destroy America. But anyway, this whole carbon capture issue, which North Dakota has been the leader on, and they actually have people doing carbon capture, that's going to be the future of sustainable aviation fuel out of ethanol. Unless we can get ethanol plants hooked up to carbon capture, they're not going to meet the requirements that the environmentalists are pushing through the administration. So part of what I was down there, I'm trying to help get people to understand that getting the carbon dioxide out of the ethanol plants and storing it is probably the most important issue to ethanol going forward. And I would say the most important issue to farmers maintaining their income. Now, Burgum understands it, but I can guarantee you not any of those other presidential candidates had a clue. And in fact, Vivek crashed carbon capture and called it a bunch of nonsense last March, not understanding what he was doing. So there's a lot of education to do, but that's part of the process. That's why they go to Iowa. They get burned because of something they said, and then they learn, and hopefully they do something better in the first in the future.
Can I ask one follow-up? I'm sorry, just one quick follow-up about carbon capture. There's been a lot of consternation, and I mean, I'm talking about the Summit Carbon Pipeline, and let's face it, building pipelines in this political environment is arduous, to say the least. There's a lot of people, particularly from the farming communities, who are pushing back against this, saying we don't want it on our land. Do you think we're going to be able to resolve that stuff? I mean, are we going to find an end line where a pipeline that can be built?
Well, I think it's probably going to happen eventually. There were some missteps made by that company in the way they went about this, but we have 4,500 miles of CO2 pipelines already in this country. And CO2 is probably the least dangerous of anything that we're putting into these pipelines. The CO2, is used as a fire retardant. It's used in beer. It's used in pop. It's not. If you have the pipeline break, it just dissipates into the air. It goes absorbed in with the oxygen. So there's a lot of misinformation being put out there. A lot of it comes from the environmental community because they don't want any of this kind of stuff. And that's part of what I'm trying to do is help farmers understand that this is important, and frankly, we have the Line 3 up here that went through right south of my farm. And, I was trying to get them to move it onto my land so I could get some of that money from Enbridge when they put the pipeline underneath, because once it's buried, you don't even know it's there, and so nobody's taking any land away from anybody.
Except when the rent check comes.
Pardon?
Except for when the rent check comes.
Well, yeah, but I mean, nobody is going to take anybody's land away. This is actually a benefit, and once it's buried, you don't know it's there. Now, there are some issues with tiling lines. So if they're going to try to come across your land and you've got your land tiled with pattern tile, then that's potentially a problem. You don't want to cut all those lines. But, there's a way I think they can go around them down the section lines and so forth to try to avoid that.
It sounds like a solvable. Sounds like a solvable
anyway,
problem.
It's a lot of educating, but I'm just telling you, if we don't do something to get this carbon index on ethanol down, I think the future of ethanol is very cloudy. And the only way that we'd stabilize farm prices in my lifetime has been with ethanol. They created a new market that stabilized the whole situation. And if we lose it, we could end up with $2 corn again. And, I just ask any farmer out there how long they're going to survive on $2 corn.
Well, and especially when you look at corn is by heads and shoulders our largest crop in the United States. You talk about the dominoes start falling. What does that do to land prices? What does that do across the board? It's terrible.
It'd be disaster.
I'm sorry. I'm really super.
Tom Bias and I are working with the American Carbon Alliance, which is not the pipelines. This is a separate 501c6 that's educating people about the benefits of that. So anyway.
Well, it's just another way that agriculture is on the cutting edge of technology. I'm going to let Ben talk now because I've been talking over him.
Well, speaking of $2 corn, I couldn't have you on, Collin, without asking you about the farm bill. But before I did that, I did just want to let you know, I looked up Vivek Ramaswamy, and he is 37 years old. So I'm glad you think he's incredibly young, because I am 36. I'm starting to get some crow's eyes under my feet, and there's a little break under the beard here. So you keep educating the whippersnappers who are running for president here. I wanted to ask you, though, with $2 corn, was there? Do you have any hope? Did you hear anything about the Farm Bill reauthorization that is, for listeners, up this year? That's up every 5 years in theory. And was there any talk about crop insurance there for the Iowa market? Do you hold out any hope for that discussion being had during the presidential election in general in 2024?
Well, we're hoping that the bill gets done before the end of this year. So if that's the case, then it takes the Farm Bill off the agenda for the presidential. The leaders of the Ag Committee are all saying the right things. They are all getting along and working together. So all of that is good. Some of the commodity groups are asking, a lot of them are asking for more money, which I don't think exists. So there's still a question about how we're going to finalize this. But, I think the process is going along as well it can. Crop insurance is going to be fine. Crop insurance is permanently authorized. It does not need a new farm bill, and there's nobody that's going to take anything away from crop insurance. There's some efforts being made, with the crop insurance system to try to get rid of these disaster programs by trying to make it in North Dakota, make it a little bit more reasonable to buy coverage so you don't have to have disaster. So there's some of that stuff going on. But crop insurance is fine. The sugar program is fine. The commodity programs that are supporting corn and soybeans are fine. And I don't think, you could raise the reference prices, but none of that money is going to go to farmers. So the reality in the Midwest is that if we just reauthorize the current law, we're going to be fine. If we're going to be fine for the next 5 years. So there is no big problem that we have to solve in the Midwest, in this farm bill. Now, that's not the case in other parts of the country. And so there are, rice has got a significant problem. Peanuts have problems. There's some controversy in dairy, but there again, there's no change that needs to be made. So, I think, if they don't get new money, what's going to end up happening, you're going to basically have a extension. They won't call it that, but it'll be an extension of the current law, is what they'll end up doing. And that is not a bad outcome for the Midwest.
Well, Congressman Peterson, I appreciate you coming on so much. Lots of interesting questions, or lots of interesting information, and certainly appreciate you coming on.
Glad to do it. Give me a call again. We can visit again.
I was going to say, new developments come up, let us know, all right?
All right. Good and done. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is James Wallner. I produce and host the podcast Dakota Spotlight, a true crime podcast that tackles historical and unsolved crimes in the upper Midwest. Follow along with me as we search for a missing girl, attempt to solve a 45-year-old murder, and much, much more. That's Dakota Spotlight Podcast, anywhere you get your podcasts, or at inforum.com/podcasts.
Ben, it's always fun talking to Collin Peterson. Because I was saying during the break, you get what's on his mind. And he doesn't.
There's no varnish there, and there's not a big political deal. And like I said, I'm biased because I grew up in Fargo. I have a farm family in eastern North Dakota, and Collin was North Dakota's second congressman for a good long time. And he and I said on air too, he was the chairman of the House Ag Committee. When he was ranking member of House Ag Committee, that means you're the highest ranking Democrat when Republicans are in charge. He was still the chair. And that's not even an insult to the Republicans. People turned to him on a bipartisan basis about ag policy. And that included Nancy Pelosi. He had her out touring Western Minnesota. That included people like, I'm forgetting the Speaker of the House, Republican Speaker of the House couple before Ryan and McCarthy. Boehner. That included Boehner. So, I mean, that was, like he said, you kept ag policy boring intentionally so that you could get what you needed for your people back home. And that if
you politicize it, and then people get locked into positions, right? Because if you politicize it, then you start defining, well, this is the Democratic position and this is the Republican position, and now people don't have any room to maneuver.
And there used to be, and there's always back and forth, and there's always partisanship, but there used to be some more wiggle room around the idea that maybe we all want the egg markets to do well, kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, even like, what he said about technology and agriculture technology, I don't think a lot of people understand that. Just from the science that goes into protecting crops from weeds and weather, the science that goes into increasing yield rates so that we don't have famine, the technology that goes into the machinery, it is mind-boggling. And I think the perception of agriculture is it's like this unsophisticated industry, run by a bunch of yokels, and that's just not true.
a perception by people who don't work in it or work around it, but it's definitely there. I took a tour of Grand Farm here just outside of Fargo in Wheatland, North Dakota last week, and they have companies from around the world. There's a German company there who has a plot of land that's testing new seed technology there, and you can take a tour and look at it. And the tour is, here's some soybeans, here's some wheat, here's another plot of land. It looks, it's a giant garden because they're testing out new biotechnology. They're testing out new kinds of autonomous sprayers, things that can things called a laser scarecrow, which is literally zapping pests that eat locusts that eat crops, so that you don't have to be spraying pesticide on them potentially, which has major implications for folks like Monsanto that create pesticides. So one of the things but
also major application for the environment. If we don't have to spray them, that's a good thing.
Yes, depending on the pesticide.
Well,
yes.
I mean, depending, yeah.
And one of the things that I want to emphasize with this, I'm glad that people like Collin Peterson's group's doing, that I'm glad that Senator Hogan supported funding out of the Ag Committee, was all of that came from funds, from research funds. Grand Farm is heavily subsidized. This program is going to be heavily subsidized, as Collin was talking about, because, as you said, he can quote chapter and verse on laws that he passed. This is a $10 million line item of the Ag Committee's budget that is currently going towards Texas A&M, aka a public university in Texas, for their research. And so I think there's also a demonization of publicly funded research. And I'd even tie that back to, and it was a political campaign promise, but I remember when Biden was getting a lot of flack for saying we want to increase research and eliminate cancer in the future, and he was being laughed off. And I was like, why in the world would medical research be a laugh line? Now, if you want to criticize, he says we can eliminate it in 3 years, and I don't think that's a realistic timeline. I don't think he said that. But the critiques weren't nuanced. It was simply, public funding for this is stupid. And I was like, "What? Where did we get this cynical?"
I think even from a conservative perspective, you can. One of the roles I think the government has to play, can play, and frankly, overall plays pretty well, is funding research that's not necessarily profitable. The private sector has a limited capacity for this. Businesses have to make money. One of the things the advantage that government has, and usually it's not a good thing, but in this instance it's a good thing. The government doesn't have to make money. The government could just spend money, and I don't want to waste money. Like I don't want to sound like I'm advocating for being wasteful. Nobody
does. There's no one. The most liberal member of Congress doesn't wake up in the morning and go, "Ooh, how can I waste some money today?" That's not a motivation really of anyone there. And very frankly, the kind of dollars we're talking about.
Waste is a subjective term.
Sure, but the kind of money we're talking about spending on these kind of research and medical and ag tech research, what we're doing, hopefully we're researching more into putting some more research into things like the CHIPS Act. It's a rounding error compared to Social Security, compared to the Pentagon budget, compared to so many other things.
The Pentagon budget is almost a rounding error compared to like Social Security and Medicare. If you look at it, well, maybe not quite a rounding error, but it's dwarfed by them. But we can, listen, funding to figure out how to make American industry work better. I mean, if you're an American first person, and I generally am in the lowercase sense of that term, not necessarily the Trumpy sense of that term, but I want American business to be competitive. I want American industry to do well. I want Americans to prosper. And one of the ways in doing that is funding the sort of research that makes industry here better, that makes products here better, that makes workers here more capable, more productive. Those are things that we should be funding. That is the proper role for government. And yeah, I realize there's probably some horror stories out there. People could bring up some boondoggles where somebody grifted a little bit, or we spent a bunch of money on something that didn't pan out, or maybe spent a bunch of money on something that was silly. But these are rounding errors. They make a lot of headlines, and they're not representative.
And that's what audits are for. And and the private sector companies do audits on themselves for the exact same reason.
Yeah. And
being vigilant does not mean you shouldn't be trying in the first place. Being vigilant about fraud doesn't mean you shouldn't be trying in the first place.
And part of the problem is a lot of times we don't hear about the success stories. I don't know how many people understand that, like, autonomous driving, it wasn't like Uber or Google or one of those companies. It was John Deere.
Yeah.
that was at the forefront of that.
Absolutely.
So
and military application tech, it becomes so many private sector innovations and consumer products. So he spoke a little bit about being down in Iowa and talking to the Republican presidential candidates, and I was very glad to hear him call Vivek Ramaswamy incredibly young, because he's only a year older than I am. So it's nice to.
He also
nice
said
he
didn't know who the hell he was, so that kind of made me laugh a little bit. And I mean, maybe if you're not paying attention to this day,
him and the rest of the electorate,
there's a ton of he's in third place now in the polling. So,
third place where? Nationally or
nationally? Yeah. Here, let me pull up.
No way.
I'm looking at
the.
I'm looking at the real. Well, hold on. This is here we go.
I find with the Republican presidential nominations, there's really a sense of 15 minutes of fame, though. Do you remember in 2008? I remember there was like a couple weeks where
sure.
Fred Thompson was definitely the nominee.
Oh, I was on the Fred Thompson train. I was all about Fred Thompson at the time.
You were on the Fred Thompson red truck that he drove and then hopped out of to go into his limousine.
No, I'm looking at the Real Clear Politics. Real Clear Politics, if you don't know, is a polling aggregator, and they run a rolling average of where they take like the last so many polls within a time period and then they average them. And it's pretty accurate. Like, it gives you a pretty good picture, because any one poll could be an outlier. This kind of averages them out, smooths them out. Ramaswamy's in third. Now, granted, it's a distant third. It's Trump basically at 54, DeSantis at 18, Ramaswamy at 5, but he's ahead of Mike Pence and Nikki Haley and Tim Scott and Chris Christie and, of course, Doug Burgum, Asa Hutchinson, which is probably why you don't necessarily know all the candidates, because there's so darn many of them. Speaking of Iowa, I'm going to be going to Iowa here next week.
That's so big news coming up the show.
This podcast we probably won't have the regular Wednesday podcast. My plan is to try to podcast from down there Friday, although there's some technical hurdles that I got to figure out between now and then. But I'm going to be heading down to follow Governor Burgum around at the Iowa State Fair. And I'm kind of excited about it. I grew up, this is how much of a nerd I am. I grew up reading like Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail in 1972, and a lot of his election coverage I always enjoyed. I'm not going to turn into a Hunter Thompson gonzo journalist, but some of his observations, about how performative this stuff is. Like, we're down and now these people who are competing with one another to control the nuclear launch codes are trying to connect with voters over a pig judging contest or something, right? I mean,
how many corn dogs can you eat in order to become the chief executive of the president of the United States?
Look at me. I am a normal person.
Hey, no Ron DeSantis impressions now. Well, I will be very interested, and there is an interesting podcast for folks who are political nerds that the Huffington Post put out a long time ago that I can't remember the name of it. I think it was called The Losers, but it was about people who had ran for major office who lost, mostly presidential candidates. And one of the best episodes by far, and this is tying into Iowa, was the Michelle Bachmann episode. I highly recommend it, because she, as partisan a figure as she absolutely was and is, she kind of dropped that persona and really talked about, here's what a day in the life of a female presidential candidate is like, going and running around the state of Iowa running for president. She's up at 4:30 in the makeup chair between 4:30 and 5:30, doing her first interview at 6. And then she has to redo her hair and makeup with a team that's following her around every about 5 or 6 hours. And so she's breaking down the timeline of every day, being up at 4:30 in the morning, going to bed about 11 p.m., doing 5 or 6 events all day in order to come in third or fourth. And you hear her talking about this, and there's a temptation to be like, well, my God, there's so much time spent on hair and makeup. This is so shallow. And then she gives examples of, here's the one time my look was off, and the only thing that was reported that day after I released this whatever policy thing was, Michelle Bachmann looks frazzled at this event. And you got to wonder, for folks like Doug Burgum, he can put on a baseball cap and wear the checkered shirt. And
unfortunately, the standards for men are different in this stuff.
The standards for men are different, but even the male candidates, we're running around in August in Iowa. It's probably going to be close to 100 degrees there, shaking hands and kissing babies for 12 hours a day.
It better not be 100 degrees down there. I am an Alaskan. I need to be refrigerated. I don't want to be toting around at the state fair 100 degrees. I'm going to, but
Well, my experience was the exact opposite. I was in Sioux City, Iowa on New Year's Eve of 2007, going into 2008, knocking on doors for President Obama. And we had hand warmers we slipped into our gloves. Well, not President Obama, at the time, Senator Obama. We had hand warmers we slipped into our gloves and into our shoes. So we go knock on doors in negative 20-degree weather. And it was hilarious because we had Californians there, people from Chicago there, and they were all freaking out. And then a bunch of volunteers from MSUM, from the college I went to, in Moorhead, Minnesota, from Minnesota, North Dakota, were like, all right, where are we going? And they're like, do you need any extra clothes? We're like, nope, we drove down on them. And then we offered one of the Californians some gloves, that work gloves that my friend Mark had. And he goes, I'm sorry, there's a little deer blood on them. I hope that's okay. And he seemed a little bit weirded out by that. But
yeah, well, a little deer blood between friends. Who cares? Speaking of Doug Burgum in Iowa and everything, we got word of what it's going to take for the governor to make the second GOP debate. Now that's going to be coming up here in late September. The first debate's going to be this month, August 23rd in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so basically Burgum's already hit half of the qualifications to make the second debate. He needs 50,000 individual donors. He hit that 12 days after hitting the 40,000 mark. He just announced that this week, 50,000 individual donors. So he's already there. The other problem is the polling requirements. So for the first debate, you had to have 1% in 3 national polls or 1% in a single national poll and in 2 early voting states. So that's like Iowa and New Hampshire. This time around, that moves up to 3%. And Burgum's already hit that in Iowa and New Hampshire. Although I don't know if those polls will count. Usually there's like a date at which the polls start counting. But he's already done that in Iowa and New Hampshire. He's been at 3% twice in Iowa. He's been as high as 6% in New Hampshire. I don't think that's going to be the problem. I think the problem is he has to have at least one national poll where he's at 3%. And so far, he has stubbornly, there have been 20, looking at the polling aggregator, Real Clear Politics, there have been 26 national surveys since mid-May that have included Doug Burgum. He has polled above 0% in 10 of them. He has polled above 1% in 0 of them. So, I don't know. I feel like that polling, that might be a heavy lift for him.
It's only going to be that debate stage that gets him there. And if he does what we talked about last time on the podcast, if he takes a back seat to Chris Christie and Ron DeSantis going at each other, and says things like, we need more small town values of people talking to each other and getting along, he and Tim Scott are going to get, I see those two as being the ones kind of preaching that message. I'm not even judging the message one way or another. I'm saying I don't think it's going to register on those national polls. He's got to have a gasp moment, or he has to have an aha moment.
He's got to capture the imagination of the public. So that means he's got to be on the debate stage, and he's already made it for Milwaukee. He can't skip any of these debates. Donald Trump, who's currently polling at like 54%, it has like a 37% lead over Ron DeSantis, who's the second place candidate. He can afford to skip debates. Doug Burgum cannot. He cannot miss any of these opportunities. Because even missing, it's not just that he's there, it's the fact that he missed the debate is going to be reported, and it's going to be more evidence for the fact that nobody cares about this guy's campaign. Now, I say all this, I kind of feel like we're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, because Donald Trump, no presidential candidate in modern political history, has failed to secure the presidential nomination while leading by more than 20 points at this point in the race. None of them ever have. It has never happened. Now,
and as consistently as he has.
Now, that being said, none of them have ever been under criminal indictment either at this point. So,
I think the field is. I think they're pulling the 2016 again. The Republican field is. No one wants to back out. They're going to divvy it up just enough, and then Republican caucuses and primaries tend to be, each state's party sets this, or the RNC sets it, I think. They tend to be winner take all. So if you do really well, or if you get a really strong third or second place, it just doesn't matter. If Trump takes first place in the first 10 states, the nomination's wrapped up. That's it. You're done.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that is the problem, right? I just don't see I don't see a path for victory for any of them. And that's not necessarily a commentary on Doug Burgum. And even like people say, well, there's too many candidates in the race. Okay, great. Let's consolidate all the non-Trump support behind one candidate. Trump's still winning pretty comfortably. So I just don't see. I don't see the path here. So
the only way to even break it up, I think, would to be have a singular alternative to him. And I don't think it's happening with this voting base, because I think there's a solid 30 to 40 to maybe 50% of the hardcore Republican primary voters that view Joe Biden as an illegitimate president and Donald Trump as their continued president, their president right now. Why would they vote against? He's an incumbent in their minds. And why would you get rid of the incumbent?
I read this really interesting analysis that it might at this point it might not even really be about beating Biden. It may be, because if you look at the polling trends, there is a sharp break where all of a sudden DeSantis was up as high as like 30% in the polling averages, and all of a sudden his poll just starts plummeting, and that happened about in March. And what also happened in March is Trump was indicted for the first time in the state of New York. And I think, and I'm not endorsing this point of view, I'm not saying it's something that I agree with, but I think there's a lot of Trump supporters out there who feel that it's not about beating Biden so much as it's about beating the deep state. You're trying to indict our guy, it's trumped up, it's contrived, and so we're going to back him just for that reason. I don't think that Ron DeSantis did anything necessarily all that wrong. I mean, we could critique his campaign, but he got to 30%. Right. So what caused him now to cut for that to essentially be cut in half? You can't really point to anything specific that he did. He didn't have any he had a couple of things, but nothing that would cause the Republican base specifically to turn against him. What happened is Trump got indicted for the first time. And that I think galvanized some of the support around him.
I don't disagree, or I agree with that analysis. I do think for a while there, Trump was an oddly sleepy or quiet person who had announced that he was running for president up until about March. And that indictment kind of got him going. And now he's on the trail a lot more, because DeSantis was being a lot louder up until then. And now they've kind of switched places. And DeSantis is he reeks of someone trying to play a character, and he's bad at it. He's bad at playing a character.
Well, and
Donald Trump's not trying to play a character. Donald Trump's exactly what he appears to be, even when he's lying. You know what he's saying.
I don't know that I agree entirely with that. I think he's a lot of it is contrived, or who knows? Maybe he's crazy. I mean, which might be one of the problems with the indictments against him. Maybe is being delusional a crime? Because one of the things they're going to have to prove is that he knew what he was telling the public about the election was false. Yeah. What if how do you prove he didn't believe it himself?
And I'm someone who follows these things, and the indictments have become white noise to me. I can't imagine. I mean, primary voters are more politically involved than the average bear, but I think they're all white noise to them. It's exactly every time it's coming from my boy, and I want to go vote for him.
Every time anyone comes out, Trump sends out more fundraising pitches. He takes in another hall. He holds another rally, and even some of the stuff where they were talking about how his political action committee is down, like they were over $100 million in the bank. Now they're down to $4 million. They're trying to claw back like a $60 million donation they gave to another Trump PAC, which may or may not be illegal. But hey, it's Trump world, so who cares about stuff like that?
Or they support it. They think that he's defending himself against what you just said.
But that's the thing.
If you're truly embedded in that conspiracy theory world, this is all fine.
Well, you're starting to see the DeSantis campaign come after Trump and say, "Oh, you're grifting. You're supposed to be spending this money on your campaign. You're actually fine." I think Chris Christie had the line where you're not funding a presidential campaign, you're funding a law firm, which I thought was a good line, but also I don't think Trump supporters care. Which leads me to believe that this is not really about winning. I mean, I don't know that they even care that they win the election. I think a lot of Trump supporters enjoy being victims. And at this point, they just want to keep their man out of prison. That to them is the victory, is keep Trump out of prison.
Yeah, it's victimhood projected. And I got a flat tire today, or I stubbed my toe, and I'm pretty sure it's the libs' fault. And if I own them, it'll be. And there is a both sides argument of that philosophy. I wanted to ask. So I saw Chris Christie was a guest on Pod Save America this week, which is a liberal podcast, a popular liberal podcast that features members of Obama's old speech team. And and the reason I mention it is it's an odd audience to reach out to if you're running for a Republican nomination for president. Now, Christie's fairly explicitly unpopular with some of the Republican electorate because he is running an explicit critique of Donald Trump campaign. The reason I bring it up, and something I think it might relate to Doug Burgum, even if he's not as explicit about it, is I believe in Iowa, of the two early voting states in the Republican primary nomination, Iowa, you have to be a registered Republican, and you have to be a registered Republican within a certain period of time before the vote. In New Hampshire, and that's a caucus, and that's a whole other ball of wax. In New Hampshire, I don't believe you have to be registered as a Republican in order to vote in the Republican primary. I'm guessing Chris Christie is doing shows like Pod Save America, and this is just a guess, just speculation, because he sees the Democratic nomination, and right now it's two, in my mind, and I think most Democrats I talk to's minds, joke candidates in Marianne Williamson and R.K. Jr., who are frankly kooky, to put it kindly, and the Democrats are going to go with Joe Biden again. If you're a New Hampshire voter, wouldn't you go and vote for who you thought to be the best Republican candidate for the nomination, in which case it would be Chris Christie? But does Doug Burgum, in a way that was talked about a lot in the 2016 primary against Wayne Stenjum, does he try to court Democratic votes explicitly in New Hampshire as the best alternative to Donald Trump? I don't think he could ever say it on record.
Well, no, he can't be on record about that. But, I mean, if he could do it and turn it into like a third place or second place win in New Hampshire, something surprising like that he could then momentum that he could build on in subsequent states, maybe. But I mean, we're living in a world right now where, like, what can you expose about Donald Trump that's going to cause his at this point that's going to cause his followers to abandon him? What else do we know?
I don't think you can. And so this isn't a perfect analogy, but there were many states where when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were running against each other for the Democratic nomination, Obama would well outperform polls because there was a turnout of younger voters who just hadn't voted before, that the Clinton campaign just wasn't expecting to show up. Could Burgum pull off, or even Christie pull off, something where there's just a population they're not polling, so they don't expect them to show up because they're mostly independents and Democrats?
Well, we're not going to know that until the votes start being counted. But I don't think so. I don't think so. I think for whatever reason, I think it's just Trump is so sticky, and there's nothing that he can do. I mean, he's a liar and a ask Mrs. Trump or Mrs. Trump or Mrs. Trump how much of a liar Donald Trump is, or heck, maybe ask Stormy Daniels how much of a liar he is. I mean, just 10% of the amount of scandal and fraud that he's been involved with would decimate the political career of anyone else, and it doesn't touch him. I don't think this latest indictment from Jack Smith is going to touch him. No. And God help us if they don't get some actual convictions on some of this stuff, because what that's going to do to empower not just Trump, but the Trump movement and the next Trumps who think that they can just get away with this stuff over and over again by just damn the torpedoes full speed ahead on everything. And nobody, I guess the point I'm trying to make is none of this is going to change until the voters want something different. In another era, Donald Trump is a non-factor because of his personal scandals in history. But we don't live in that era. We live in this era, and right now the voters don't care about, at least Republican voters, and at least, a majority of Republican voters who are showing up at the primary polling, they don't care about it.
And, it's cold comfort, but Donald Trump is a down-ticket loser. He has not played well for the RNC in midterms when Democrats who are running statewide and otherwise purple-ish states are able to use Donald Trump as a villain to run against. They're able to turn out their base and usually win and take seats back. Joe Biden had a historically, if you're rooting for Democrats, if you're rooting for the DNC, had the best midterms of a first-term Democratic president in 80 years.
Donald Trump almost single-handedly turned Georgia into a purple state.
And largely due to the fingerprints and the stylings and the imitations, candidates imitating Donald Trump. So there's a little bit of comfort in that, for me, as someone who, also obviously, to no one's surprise, doesn't like the stylings and lack of substance and lack of consistency and morality that a Donald Trump presents.
Well, whatever happens with this election, Donald Trump, I think this is probably the last election cycle, the Donald Trump presidential election cycle, that he's going to be a participant in. Because if he wins, he's term limited. And if he loses, I think he's going to be aged out because he's going to be in his 80s by the time the next election comes along. I just don't see how he can keep it up. So I think this is the last one. But his movement and what he's done to American politics, that's going to cast a shadow across American politics for a long time to come. Realignment is the word. And to me, it's going to be interesting if Democrats could figure out a way to not be so offensive to moderate Republicans, we could really see some votes move in some significant ways. And that has implications for states like North Dakota, which not so long ago was electing Democrats pretty consistently.
Or from 1986 to 2010 had an all Democratic federal delegation. That's not a short period of time.
And for parts of that, a Democratic governor, Democratic statewide office holders for parts of that time. So, yeah, it's
very extremely moderate Democrats,
right?
Mind you.
But Democrats, right? I'm not casting aspersions on anyone. I'm just saying,
no, but
there may be a realignment coming where people who believe. I wrote about it this week where I wrote about I'm so frustrated. It was Milt Friedman's 111th birthday, if I could put it how Bilbo Baggins put it.
Everyone was celebrating.
Yeah. Well, he was important to me. Milt Friedman was
important to many people.
Was inspirational for me early on. His concept of being free to choose, the idea that like as an individual we should protect my right to make as many choices, good or bad, as I can, and trusting that in the aggregate most people are generally going to make good choices. That resonated with me, and it makes me so sad the degree to which Republicans have abandoned this. I mean, Friedman was an advisor to Ronald Reagan. He was an advisor to Margaret Thatcher. If you're a conservative, he was a big deal. And I don't think he has a place in this Republican Party that's against free trade, that's against entitlement reform, that's against a lot of the things that he champions. So, I guess this is another morose diatribe from me about what's happening to the Republican Party. But I think Democrats would be smart. I mean, they've got their own problems. They would be smart if they could find a way to become a home to some of these Republicans. I just don't know. I don't know how they do it. And
there's plenty of room for capture and expansion on the Democrats' part. And it's going to, a lot of things come from the top. The DNC needs to learn to be a 50-state party again. They need to run ads and run candidates in places like Oklahoma and Wyoming.
We've been talking about that for 15 years. And I just don't. Maybe someday it'll happen. What do you think of this, though? One thing, our Congressman Kelly Armstrong, who I have an enormous amount of respect for Kelly Armstrong. I think he's a serious congressman. He's been doing a lot of stuff on the Hunter Biden thing. And he just had an op-ed in the Bismarck Tribune about it. And I think he makes a lot of fair points. But I get to the bottom of that column, and I want to say to him, okay, now do Trump.
I don't know. Where you focus your attention it's a lot of that personal stuff. It is confusing to me. And the fact that we have so many House panels just investigating individual members of famous political families ad nauseum, and we really don't have a lot of Collin Petersons anymore. Yeah. And even serious-minded people.
But I remember both sides have been doing this. I mean, I remember when we were on the edge of a new Democratic majority and Nancy Pelosi was talking about how she was bragging about all the subpoena power she was going to have to go after the Bush administration. The parties have been re-upping one another on this stuff. And now it's like that's all they ever do is like, well, we want to control House so that we can form a bunch of committees to investigate our political enemies.
And I actually don't see much of a constituency for that. In all seriousness, I don't think the average voter is walking around going, I really want to know about the business dealings in his 30s of the son of the president who's not in his
I disagree. I think absolutely. I mean, if you put it in a more generalized way, I think absolutely a lot of Republican voters want dirt on Biden. They already believe that Biden's corrupt and terrible. Now They want the proof for it. It doesn't even matter. They just want to put them through.
The format of the proof doesn't matter at all.
In the same way that Democrats felt, we wanted to prove that George W. Bush is a war criminal or Dick Cheney's the worst human being to ever walk planet Earth. It's that attitude where we want to get in control so that we could stick it to the other side is wrong. You should want to get control so that you could serve the American public and serve the needs of our country and quit making it a tit for tat against one another.
And Trumpism has created a large vacuum of not actually doing anything that Democrats can take advantage of. We're too late in the podcast to get into this. I feel like there are a lot of things the Biden administration has done that aren't sexy, that have filled in that vacuum, and the electorate, I don't know how much the electorate cares, but then again, he had a great midterm. We'll see how Biden and folks that Biden is close to do in 2024. Maybe it does play out for them. Maybe that boring stuff is gonna help out.
I will tell you, I am depressed that it seems like the choices in 2024 are going to come down between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, when I know that there are candidates from both parties who would be so much better than this. But that seems to be where we're heading. We're going to put a pin in it there.
Hey, I'm looking forward to finding out what kind of booth you have in Iowa, and if you see Vivek Ramaswamy, ask him if you can do an interview with him.
I don't think I'm going to have a booth. I'm just going to be following him around. We're not going to spring for a booth. I may need to spring for a new pair of walking shoes to keep up with this governor.
Well, if you see, Chris Christie or Ron DeSantis there, and you happen to try and chase after him with a microphone, just text me. We can do an impromptu interview.
Can we? Yeah. All right. Yeah. I'll see.
We'll turn you to a gonzo journalist yet.
I'll see what I can do. It'll be a lot of fun. Hey, coming up on Friday, Chad Oban and I are going to be talking about teacher shortages. We've got the head of the Education Standard Practices Board on, Rebecca Pitkin. I think that's her name. I'm sorry, that's terrible. I should remember her name. I booked it. It's on the calendar. But that's coming up on Friday. And then
we'll look up her name and spell her name correctly for the interview.
Yeah, that's right.
And then both else we're calling.
And then next week we will be. We will probably not have a show on Wednesday the 9th. And the plan is to have a show from Iowa on the 11th with Chad and Ben, kind of talking about some of what I've seen down there. But again, that's up in the air, and I've got some technical challenges. I got to figure out how the heck I'm going to do that. So, but thank you so much for listening. We'll talk again. Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.